try to not assume very much. I'm going to go over the essential features of Nigeria, and then look at the emergence of Boko Haram. Then I'll look at the demographic crisis that I believe is driving Boko Haram, and then talk about how globalization has had a perverse effect on northern Nigeria. All right, so for those of you that aren't familiar, this is Nigeria. Right? It is the largest country in population in Africa. I'll give you some figures. The area that's most important, I don't have a laser, but over in the east, Borno is very important, the far north, Kano, this triangle. This border here with Chad and Cameroon is very important for Boko Haram location. There's a set of mountains on the border that they've managed to take the girls, and there's a forest called the Sambisa Forest about where Bu is, going to the east, where they have camps. This is a shot to try to give you a sense of how significant Nigeria is within the Muslim world. So Nigeria is approximately 178 million people, half of whom are Muslim. Not all are Sharia-minded Muslims that follow Sharia, but you can see the significance of this cluster around Nigeria for the density of Islamic belief and practice. Because of the growth rates in Africa, Nigeria will be one of the largest Muslim countries in the world when it finishes growing. It's at a minimum 515 million people, and then the estimates get much larger after that. So demography is destiny and very important in the Nigerian case. So here are some points that are important to bear in mind as we think about Nigeria. It is the only country in Africa, possibly with the exception of South Africa, that has a scale to create and sustain an internal market. It has 178 million people, roughly 20% of sub-Saharan Africa. It has at least an electoral system, if not a democracy, but it's becoming increasingly democratic with a vibrant civil society, including Islamic groups that are engaged in civil society activity, but throughout Nigeria. And it has, especially in southern Nigeria, an emergent middle class with higher incomes. This emerging population in southern Nigeria is very important for a recovery strategy for northern Nigeria, Muslim northern Nigeria, as compared to others. It's also, as you know, an energy exporting state, member of OPEC. It has the potential for 2.5 million barrels a day. It is producing far less. It has other features I'll talk about in a moment. And liquefied natural gas is growing. They flare enormous amounts of gas, roughly 65 to 75%, enough to provide energy for most people in Nigeria. And for the point of view of U.S. interest, it is a secure energy source compared to the Gulf. It has many features, light in weight, more gallons of gasoline can be produced per barrel. And its growth rate has been very high, over 7%, and it's not all energy. In fact, the proportion of the economy represented by oil and natural gas is declining. You've had an enormous increase in telecommunications. Nigeria went from roughly 500,000 landlines in 2001, half of which did not work, to about 120 million mobile subscribers. So the mobile phone revolution has transformed the economy, transformed communication and culture. The most important aspect of globalization, economic globalization, has been the information revolution in Nigeria. There are a rise in agricultural production. There are free trade zones being set up in Nigeria, in southern Nigeria around Lagos. Lagos is comparatively well governed with industries, commerce, very important. It is, as I mentioned, a democracy. We'll have an election on Valentine's Day. February 14th will be the federal election in Nigeria, critical for the resolution of the crisis with Boko Haram. And it's always been a regional security partner for peace and peacekeeping in Africa. And it has this importance of the dominant power, because it's now the largest economy in Africa that has surpassed South Africa in gross national product. Now, the risk then for a breakup or a conflict or insecurity that Boko Haram represents to Nigeria will destabilize the whole region. Millions of refugees would be pumped out throughout the region. So the problem, the nature of Nigeria is critical for regional stability. Now that has a few serious problems, Nigeria. Governance. We have no elite consensus among the elites, true elite fragmentation at the national level over the goals or a national development strategy, especially a recovery strategy for northern Nigeria. You have competition for petrol rents. Roughly 90% of the foreign exchange and 80% of government revenue comes from petrol rents. Massive institutional corruption, legitimacy, concern about security. Kidnapping is endemic all over. Oil bunkering. Oil bunkering is a metaphor for stealing. You have 150 to 300 barrels a day stolen. The theft is so large that they're using local wood-fired refineries in the Niger Delta to produce gasoline. All of this has been researched and monitored. The Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation is rife with scandal. The petroleum reform bill is stalled, and you have what are called an import coalition that imports refined product because the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation refineries function below 20% of capacity, and because there's a difference between the international price and the local subsidized price, vast rents are paid to people with the contract to import refined products. The constitutional paralysis I mentioned, security, crime throughout, and the more important in the case of Boko Haram, the politicization of security. Different elites are blaming the others, the two national parties, each one accusing the other of somehow supporting the Boko Haram insurgency. You have these insurrections in the Niger Delta, the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta, which has been co-opted by the present government, and they are leaders of the MEND insurgency are now running security firms to quote unquote protect pipelines. You have the last military corruption, demoralization, mutinies in the north, and vast human rights abuses with security forces committing human rights abuses with impunity. So let me try to summarize my argument here. I want to begin arguing the beginning here. I'm going to talk about Boko Haram, but this is a demographic ecological crisis in the Muslim North. Right? You have very high population growth and a deteriorating environment, so that the population is complemented by conflicts between pastoralists and sedentary agriculturalists, which sometimes are accused of being Boko Haram, but are in fact ecologically driven. Global warming and population growth is eroding the environment and limiting the productivity of land in the north. Now, this has led to a generational revolt and a 12-year insurgency. There's enormous disillusionment with the leadership in power, the generation in their 60s and 70s who continue to maintain control. It is most likely a 70-year-old former general will be nominated as the opposition political candidate, Buhari. Right? And this insurgency has gone on for 12 years. You have governance failures on the part of the Yan Boko and the political elites. The Yan Boko refers to those who have Western education. Boko is the Hausa word for Western education. It comes from the Hausa word meaning deceptively inauthentic, which is a measure of the power of the ulama to label Western education as false education. Part of the enormous investment in cultural resistance that northern Nigerian elites and the general population have had. There's governance failures and fragmentation at the federal, state, and LGA levels, local government authorities. The major problem on the part of the northern states here is that they have failed to allow local governments to hold elections and be responsible to the local population. So vast areas of the north, especially in the northeast, are ungoverned. You have the fragmentation of religious and political authority, which I'll talk about, and it's led because of an initiative in 2000 to implement the reintroduction of Sharia criminal law to the 12 northern states, which I'll show you in a moment, has led to the expectation, a utopian expectation, that returning to Sharia law will solve all their problems. This opened up opportunities for Boko Haram to make that claim and to critique the Yan Boko, the educated elite who implemented the political Sharia. You have finally the perverse dialectic of two globalization processes on northern Nigeria, which I refer to as economic versus Muslim globalization processes. So here's a map of Nigeria in the last election. The 12 states to the north that are shadowed are the 12 Sharia states. They are the only states that voted for Muhammad Buhari, the leader of the opposition. The red dots show the old northern region was in 1963. This was established by the British. And this northern Nigeria represents territorially not only over half of the population of Nigeria, but approximately 72% of the landmass. So the crisis in northern Nigeria is critical to the stability and the continuance of the Nigerian Federation. Here's a slide to try to give you some idea of the background. These are the two states in Nigeria that were pre-colonial states. On the left, you have the Sokoto Caliphate, approximately 35 emirates united in a federation under a Sultan of Sokoto, and the other is Bornu, the Sultanate of Bornu, the oldest Muslim state in Nigeria. These are pre-colonial states that established Sharia law in the 19th century, but far earlier by origin. Now, what I want to do is, this gives you a little summary on the class on the history of indirect rule. You have the British conquering northern Nigeria in 1903. They rule indirectly, appointing Muslim emirs, chiefs, and judges. So there's always been a parallel system of Islamic courts throughout the colonial period, and the administration by reformed or modernized officials in the so-called native authority. Sharia law continued, and it was deepened and extended over non-Muslim groups in the center of the country. Sufi brotherhoods thrived under the colonial import trade, especially the Tijaniya. and you had a fierce rejection of Western education and Western culture on the part of the ulama, and that's where this metaphor of Boko arises. The education in the Muslim North, therefore, without Christian missionaries, falls way behind the Christian South, and the educated elites, who are largely from the notables, if not from the aristocracy, from those that were associated with the native authority, gained access to Western education, and they take power and independence. And it's an independence where the North is authoritarian, under authoritarian rule. It is comparatively and educationally backward, and it is poor, but remains dominant by after a series of coups, especially in the period from 1983 to 1999, through military rulers. So northern generals, 4 northern generals controlled Nigeria between 1983 and 1999. In 1999, there's an election, a transition from civilian to military rule. Let's give you another shot of the map of the region. And let me just go over the sort of origins of Boko Haram. These are some of the categories I want to think about. We'll look at British colonialism, which we've already done. We look at the key intellectual figure for the promotion of Salafism in Nigeria is Abubakar Gumi, a close confidant and ally of the Saradan of Sokoto, well connected in Saudi Arabia, member of the World Muslim League, and he establishes an organization for the establishment of the Sunnah, to translate it, and the promotion of the Sunnah and the scraping away of innovations. And its nickname is Izala. Muhammad Yusuf is the charismatic sheikh who is part of Izala and then splits off and forms what will be known as Boko Haram. He calls himself, it's either called the Yusufiya, named after Yusuf, or it's a movement called Ahl Sunnah, people who follow the Sunnah. I'll talk about their goals. We'll look at the phases of the Boko Haram insurgency and the conflicts that lead up to the present, and then I'll talk about the basis of support for Boko Haram. So, elite fragmentation. So, if we look at the fragmentation of religious authority, extremely important in the case of Nigeria. Northern Nigeria was known for its solidarity, for its authority, its ability to form coalitions, to manage a multi-ethnic Muslim elite in the north, because they shared a common experience of those pre-colonial empires, membership in office-holding groups, an aristocracy, an obedient population, integrated by, in the colonial period, by 2 major brotherhoods, the Qadiriya or the Tijaniya. You could not find a description less likely to capture contemporary Nigeria. You have an open revolt in northern Nigeria, enormous amounts of violence inflicted upon the emirs by Boko Haram and by criminal elements. But this initial period is under Sufis, and in this period, Gumi emerges as an anti-Sufi scholar, very close to the Saudis, who are well-known hostility to the Sufi brotherhoods. His advantage comes in 1956 when the French and British, especially the British, ally with the Israelis and invade Egypt. Saudi Arabia breaks diplomatic relations with the Brits, and it leaves Nigerian pilgrims without a representative in the Hijaz, in the pilgrimage cities, and Abubakar Gumi is appointed by the Sardan of Sokoto in 1956, when there's regional self-government, to represent Nigerian Muslims. He is a brilliant scholar. He connects extremely well in Saudi Arabia, becomes the major conduit for patronage from Saudi Arabia, which becomes important after 73, 74 with the price revolution in OPEC oil. And he creates a modern organization, Izala. Izala is formed in 1978. It's organized as a trust. It opposes magic. It opposes charisma, any intermediation. It has a devastating critique of the Tijaniya Brotherhood, accusing them of shirk or polytheism. And its success is to recruit groups from outside the mainstream in different regions of Nigeria, not in the traditional commercial centers, and especially Western-educated scholars who have the capacity to read the text as Salafist scholars require, and they are innovative. We can't spend the time on it, but we could spend the whole class on looking at the innovations of Izala. They favor women's education, and they have a pedagogical style that's much less hierarchical. They oppose genuflections to authority, and they appeal to youth. Fascinating example of the combination of tradition and modernity in the Izala. They spearhead the demand for return to Sharia criminal law in Nigeria. Gumi actually has the Constitutional Commission consider establishing Sharia criminal law throughout Nigeria, and they effectively proselytize a youthful generation coming out of the universities. And most important here is Gumi in 1978 declares the Tijaniya Sufis apostates and it introduces takfir into the political discourse, and it opens the door to killing Muslims in Nigeria. He announces this in a mosque in Kaduna in 1978, and Izala's Salafism drives the restoration of criminal law from 2000 to 2003 in the 12 northern states. So the shift here is extremely important. Izala splinters after Gumi's death in 1992 over takfir. A scholar named Jafar Adam emerges as the most important. Muhammad Yusuf is a student of Jafar. Jafar is from the Hausa-speaking area based in Kano. They both preach at a mosque in Maiduguri known as the Ndimi Mosque. Ndimi is a petro baron who's received contracts in Maiduguri and built a large mosque complex. They both preach there. Yusuf is actually the leader of the youth wing of Izala in this region. Yusuf breaks in 2002 with Izala. Izala accepts the Nigerian state, believes it's problematic, but accepts it, and Jafar alienates Yusuf because he advocates in 2003 that northern Muslims vote for Buhari, thus participating in legitimizing the election and the state. Yusuf opposes Western education because it mixes genders, and he has a whole repertoire of critiques of Western science, not unlike creationism in the US, I should note, and other doctrines that favor scriptural explanations for the natural world. But if you read his text closely, he doesn't oppose all forms of modernity, only if it conflicts with a literal reading, his reading of the Quran and the Sunnah. he declares the Nigerian state as un-Islamic, which is obviously true. It's a multi-confessional secular state, and he opposes state employment. So you have young people that are mesmerized by his charismatic preaching, burning their public documents, passports, and their certificates of education. He attacks the lifestyle and legitimacy of the Western-educated elites, the Boko meaning Western-educated elites, and he creates a opportunity for the urban poor. He opens up microcredits, schools, feeding, farms. So he has a whole economic and social program as well. And he's considered an extreme preacher, but nonetheless a legitimate member of the ulama. Many of his speeches and his debates with other members of Izala or the other clergy are on YouTube, and he comes across quite sane, quite reasonable, quite courteous in these debates. So the next phase is to look at the alliances, and I'm going to spend a moment on Boko Haram. So he's charismatic, and he's what we call an ultra-Salafist. There is a series of Saudi sheikhs he identifies with and writes a book. I do that, and he also appeals. He creates an enclave in the city, and the name of the mosque in which the enclave is established is the Ibn Taymiyyah Mosque, the 13th century Hanbali scholar who rejects the backsliding behavior of the Mongol rulers. The analogy is clear for the Boko. He forms an alliance with the governor, where the governor funds Boko Haram and supports the governor of Borno, the northeast state, and where the governor uses the members as party thugs, political party thugs. Most importantly, the governor appoints a member of Boko Haram to be commissioner of religious affairs in the state. So there's a clear alliance in this period with officials. He establishes this mosque, names it after Ibn Taymiyyah. He approaches people about starting a newspaper. So it's a combination of a modern movement and a ultra-Salafist movement. I emphasize this because he's painted as irrational and as extremely rigid and backward, where in fact his program, there's evidence of combining many different aspects. And I'm listing some of his charity, farms, trainings. He actually funds a microcredit scheme, and his social base is quite varied. I'll give you an example of the social base in a moment. And he has a vast media campaign. He has people making cassettes of his speeches, digital videos. So after 2009, when there's an insurrection, the security forces are running through the markets attempting to buy up the cassettes and digital videos, when in fact his followers have posted them on YouTube and on internet sources, and people are downloading them on their smartphone. So, the phases of the insurrection. There's a movement of radical students in beginning in 2002 to 2004 and 5, who practice hijra, withdrawing from Maiduguri, going into Yobe State to the west, and establishing a community. They enter into conflict with locals over fishing and farming rights, but it's clear that they've fortified their village near the Niger border. They go into conflict with the officials. They're asked to leave the area. They then after that are attack the police stations, request taking weapons. They're chased then in 2003 and reemerge in Gwoza, GwOza, near the border with Cameroon, which is one of their areas of strength. And at this point, he has a falling out by 2006 and 7 with Sharif. This group they're called the Taliban in Yobe. Muhammad Yusuf's actually gone to Mecca and Medina. He spends time at the International Islamic University of Medina, where the Izala attempt to convince him to give up his rejection of the Nigerian state and to moderate his views. He agrees with them while he's in Saudi Arabia, rejects it when he comes home. Gradually, has a falling out with the governor. There's a series of conflicts between the police and his followers. 17 are shot in June of 2009 for failing to wear motorcycle helmets. And they're denied medical attention. This leads to a declaration of jihad, an insurrection especially against the police by Muhammad Yusuf. And there's an urban insurrection within Maiduguri and Borno and 4 other states in July of 2009. This is the key event where the rupture launching Boko Haram as a jihadi movement occurs. You have a brutal suppression by police army with vast extrajudicial killings, all of which are available on YouTube and by Al Jazeera reporters showing indiscriminate killing of anyone who looks like a member of Boko Haram. And that includes, the evidence for that is sheikhs are issuing fatwas telling people it's okay to shave their beards to save their lives. Now this then disperses the followers, estimated around 10 to 15,000 members of Boko Haram throughout the Sahel and outside of Nigeria in response to this. A large amount of property of mosques, buildings are lost by members of Boko Haram. And the extrajudicial killings include the father-in-law and the commissioner of religious affairs. The father-in-law of Muhammad Yusuf turns himself in and then is assassinated while under police custody. Muhammad Yusuf is assassinated under police custody, and so is the commissioner of religious affairs, Foy, and the general presumption about people who are informed in Nigeria. This is to cover up the relationship between Muhammad Yusuf and the Borno political elite. And it slaughter and dispersal of Boko Haram members across Nigeria and the Sahel region, including the Middle East and Saudi Arabia, occurs. The next phase is the jihad phase. In 2010, you have the emergence of Abu Bakr Shekau, who declares grievance in jihad. In September of 2010 in Bauchi, there is a prison break, and here you have a very disciplined group of militants who tell people in Bauchi to avoid being injured. They should follow their orders. There's an attempt to avoid killing innocent people, but it's important to see the prisons as the centers of Boko Haram recruitment, because the police are doing sweeps and putting people in jail, and Boko Haram preachers are converting them within the jails. So the prisons are important. This follows assassinations of police, clerics. You have new bombings. They open up and attack Christians in Jos. In 2011, there's an increase in tactics where they've been trained in suicide bombings and strategies of ambushing. They bomb the police headquarters. This is after the police commissioner threatens to remove and eliminate them in 2 weeks. Immediately after that, they manage to enter his motorcade and explode a suicide bomber in police headquarters in Abuja, the capital. 2011, you have suicide bombings of the UN, death toll increases, and these attacks are important until the major one in Kano, the economic center, the second largest city, in January of 2012, where they take out the entire security structure of the Nigerian equivalent of the FBI, the SSS, and the police and the immigration authority in the second largest city. All right, then this leads to what I call the third phase, which is panic on the part of the elites. And I want to emphasize elite fragmentation here. You have the bombings in different parts of the capital. Most of the bombings and attacks occur in northern Nigeria. There's only one that they take responsibility for in Lagos more recently. In January 2012, the president imposes emergency rule, closes the northern border. He subsequently establishes emergency rule in 3 northeastern states, about 1/6 of the territory. In February, you have more suicide bombings. This is a listing of the conflicts. At this point, the next question is the linkages with internationals. You have the emergence, and that we have evidence of linkages. Ansaru is the name for a splinter group that's more closely aligned with AQIM, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, in Algeria and Mali. Clear trainings. If you go over the history of the German engineer they pick up, you actually have 3 countries involved, where a video appears. The German engineer is picked up in Kano in January of 2012. Everyone presumes he's in Kano. The video shows up from Al-Qaeda in Mauritania, and then the next claim on Al-Qaeda in Mauritania is a prisoner transfer for someone imprisoned in Germany for attacking an American base. This shows the transnational linkages have developed, although Boko Haram is overwhelmingly a local movement. There is no evidence of international members in it in terms of bodies, corpses. There's no prisoners that have been brought in by Nigerian security from different places, other countries, and it remains local, but you certainly have these linkages. There's claims of linkages with militants with Mujau in Mali, but there's difficult to provide any convincing evidence there. There's clearly Nigerians. There's a presence of Boko Haram. There's certainly recruiting from Niger and Chad, but they remain focused on, in Cameroon's case, on kidnapping, and Nigeria on kidnapping to finance themselves. Okay, so what's the social base of Boko Haram? This continues, and we can talk about the contemporary. At the broadest level, there's great sympathy in northern Nigeria for what Hodgson calls the Sharia-minded. People who believe the transfer of Western institutions and Western law has been a failure in Nigeria. This is not difficult to empirically verify. And from northern Muslims who committed to Sharia law, this represents the largest and most sympathetic group. The increasing violence by Boko Haram, the kidnapping of girls has reduced this, but there's great sympathy for Muhammad Yusuf's original program to have Sharia law. The next are elites. This movement begins as university graduates and university discussion groups in tertiary education around the Indimi Mosque, and there's a whole list of members of the elite who are affiliated with this group. They are no longer active. There's an original shura, a council that originally allegedly has 17 members. It's now been increased to 35 allegedly, and these are some of the people whose children have been shown to be part of it. There is most of the followers are Western-educated school dropouts, or what we call Quranic students. In Hausa, they're called Gardua. That's somebody who's finished the Quran, and Al-Majri are wandering, itinerant Quranic students who subsist on charity while studying. And the social base is the urban, impoverished youth in the informal sector, peddlers, service workers, people that sell used clothing. Abubakar Shekau sold used bottles in the market before he became a jihadi. Another group are the victims of police and security sweeps. The Nigerian Army, the Joint Task Force, sweeps areas, abuses, and according to human rights groups, murders people, and this creates victims, and people end up supporting them. Another source is people just being paid, and the governor of Borno has testified that he's shocked at the number of poor people and youths in cities that would act as lookouts and be part of Boko Haram, and this is part of the condition. And since around 2009, the membership has become increasingly drawn from poor and more extreme groups. There's an increase in levels of violence in this case. So the questions that concern us now are divisions with Boko Haram movement. We can talk about this in Q&A. The moderates versus the extremists. The moderates wish to negotiate a peace agreement with the government. There's a whole set of conspiracy theories on why the federal government, is not doing so. The next is the role of the civilian joint task force. The military is paying unemployed youths to act as militias. If you Google Frontline and Boko Haram, you'll find a starkly shocking video from Frontline showing the way the civilian militias are murdering without trial large numbers of youths in cities who are accused of belonging to Boko Haram. So the youths are forced to choose between the civilian joint task force and Boko Haram. You have also a counterinsurgency by a new national security advisor, a son of the former Sultan of Sokoto, which doesn't have operational powers but is attempting counterinsurgency and attempts to deal with the social and governance problems. Negotiation with the federal government is correlated with increasing use of terrorist violence by Boko Haram and counter-violence by the security forces. You have questions about challenges Shekau's leadership, and one can find no program that Boko Haram is offering other than everyone should convert to Islam and join and accept Sharia. The significance too of the kidnapping of girls and Western pressure, and you have regional implications of this conflict in all the surrounding states that pose problems that we can talk about. We could talk more about global linkages. Now, let me just go and talk about the underlying causes. I'm following your colleague Jack Goldstone's famous book on the origins of revolt, published in 1991, early modern Europe, in Ottoman world, and in China. And what he argues is that it is driven by, these revolts are driven by a demographic crisis, which makes it impossible for the existing labor markets to absorb youths. This is complemented by divisions within the political elite. That's why I've emphasized fragmentation and conflicts among the political elite. Third element is the incapacity of the state to manage this and exercise governance, and that certainly is found in northern Nigeria. And finally, this apocryphal phrase he uses, the attraction to heterodox religious movements. And that's clearly Boko Haram is a heterodox movement. So that you have a demographic crisis, you have this insurgency, and unless you deal with the demographic crisis, the per capita incomes can only decline, which will create a pool of recruits, a small number of which will maintain either criminality, Boko Haram, or new radical movements. The health and education budgets cannot meet the increase in population I'm going to show you in a moment. And the current trends, the demographic trends, guarantee waves of urban migrants every 14 years, reaching 14 years going to cities, and you have an unlimited supply of extremist groups. So at the bottom of this, unless they change the status and educational status and resources for girls' education and the status of women, it's difficult to see how governance reforms can make a difference here. So here's a projection of the population in the Sharia states. Here is a key table. This is the fertility rate by zone in Nigeria. In the northwest zone, where in the northeast, Borno is in the northeast zone, but this whole area down in the south is not a Muslim area. The Sharia states are in the north. This is a Christian mixed area here. The northwest, where it's roughly 7.3 to 7.4 births per woman, shows you the population growth. We estimate the population growth rate is 3.2, 3.3%, which means the population will double in 12 or 13 years. This is, and look at the difference between the northern Muslims and the southwest, the most developed area at the bottom. And that southwest region is approximately 50% Muslim, but it's non-Sharia minded Muslims, people from the Yoruba community. Here's a table that tries to show the demographic argument here for the need to provide education for girls. This is the proportion of girls, women 15 to 19, using the best data set available, the Demographic and Health Survey, and you can see the proportion is around 45% on average. The Northwest, 45%, where they've already either pregnant or already have a child. Early marriage, early birth can be prevented by expanding girls' education, which is permissible even by the most conservative sheikhs. This secondary school for girls is most important, all studies show, which really has an effect on fertility and on raising the status of girls, and it's trivial. There's enormous opportunities to do something there. Here's an example of the proportion of women 15 to 49 who have ever completed secondary school in the north. Katsina, less than 1%. And this continues with the same proportions and increase in the south. This is educational attainment from the Sharia states. And here is the use of contraception. Negligible, less than 4% in the Sharia states. So this population is almost certainly going to increase in the crisis unless there's a strategy on the part of the political elites to do something about it, will continue. This leads, of course, to poverty. Is the proportion of the population living on $1 a day, the highest in the Northwest. Malnutrition of children, highest in the Sharia states. This is nutrition, stunting. Children under 5 are underweight. And so it is clearly, this is the evidence for the nature of the demographic crisis. And the problem with the demographic crisis is when people are born, they come, they have rights, they have expectations, and they represent a movement to be recruits for future movements. Now, let me just talk a little bit about globalization. What the perversity of globalization is that economic globalization had a devastating effect on northern Nigeria. It had industries, had over 60,000 industrial workers in 1983 in the city of Kano. Kaduna actually assembled automobiles to the south. And it had linkages in the textile industry, cotton producers, and probably 100 to 200,000 textile workers in northern Nigeria. There was a decision to required one, of course, to have structural adjustment. So structural adjustment was implemented in 1986 without ever allowing or dealing with the need for spare parts. So you had a massive industrial collapse due to the high cost of spare parts, the high cost of inputs. Once the currency was depreciated, was $1.50 per naira, $1.50 per naira in 1980, 82, 83, and now it is about 175 naira to the dollar. That'll tell you the nature of the devaluation. You have a situation where economic globalization has created a vast base for recruits. The collapse of banking, this is partially self-inflicted because of opposition to interest. Access to new media has not been one where the northern Muslims have been able to adjust to. This is in part due to Sharia Commission and conservative policies under the Sharia, strong Sharia states. And you have the liberalization of the economy, which shifts economic power from the state employment sector, so that the federal character, which is an affirmative action program, operates outside of the new liberal competitive economy that's driving economic development in Nigeria, that's explaining the 7% growth rate. But most of the opportunities are outside northern Nigeria, and the northerners are poorly situated to take advantage of it. And I'm mentioning Jack Goldstone's theory here, so that the problem here is economic globalization is correlated, contributes to regional polarization between North and South, rising poverty, and the marginalization of the Muslim North. Now, the impact of Muslim globalization process, I subscribe to working on a argument in a paper on looking at Muslim globalization. I argue in this paper that the Muslims effectively invented the first form of globalization by the year 1000. If you take the standard international relations definition of globalization, you have multiple polities, networks, increasing flows across borders, common language and culture, and network-driven system. It is the infrastructure that the Portuguese use in the Indian Ocean is in fact a Muslim infrastructure. So we have Muslim global networks active in northern Nigeria, but they're promoting Salafism and Sharia as what I would call a utopian vision. The Salafists distribute and monopolize the patronage from the Gulf and provide access to education, especially, and other opportunities, economic opportunities through these networks. That you have the pivotal role of the International Islamic University in Medina. I want to recommend the forthcoming work of Alex Thurston on the Islamic University of Medina for training Salafists within Africa and throughout the Muslim world. And the paradox is of the return to civilian rule in the liberal Constitution of 1999 is that liberal democracy was ideal for the Salafist demands for implementing Sharia. The paradox here also is the new information networks facilitated command and communication and propaganda outlets for Boko Haram insurgents to challenge the Nigerian state. They're much more effective users of the new media than the northern Muslim elite who has almost no capacity, or the federal government. So the global media infrastructure provides images, models, and strategy for the insurrection. They've clearly influenced by ISIS, kidnapping, they've declared a caliphate and Gwoza in the region, and this is the problem where globalization has exacerbated the problem, having a perverse effect. The overall problem in northern Nigeria, the northern Muslims, is that they are blocked from forming or theorizing and implementing a transition to a Muslim modernity project, in my view. I'm going to stop now and answer questions on northern Nigeria, Boko Haram. Thank you very much.